At 72 years old, I stood in that wedding hall and watched my own son destroy me in front of 200 people. That was the day I learned that some betrayals cut deeper than death. Hey everyone, before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that touch your soul. Trust me, you'll want to follow this journey to the end. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, and I'm 72 years old. My hands shake a little as I write this, not from age but from the memory I'm about to share with you. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds just learn to hide better. What happened at my grandson's wedding 3 years ago changed everything I thought I knew about family, about love, about the sacrifices mothers make, and how little they can mean in the end. Sit with me a while, dear reader. Let an old woman tell you a story that still makes her cry in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is asleep and memories come calling like ghosts. It was a Saturday in June. One of those perfect summer days when the sky is so blue it hurts to look at it. My grandson Jasper was marrying a lovely girl named Autumn, and I'd been looking forward to this day for months. You see, after my husband Bernard died 5 years ago, family gatherings became my oxygen. They were the only times I felt truly alive, surrounded by the people I'd spent my whole life loving and sacrificing for. I'd raised 3 children: my son Finn, my daughter Cora, and my youngest son Wade. Finn was my eldest, my first baby, the one who'd made me a mother 47 years ago. He was a successful real estate developer now, married to a woman named Sloan, living in a house so big you could fit my entire childhood home in the foyer. The wedding was held at the Riverside Estate, one of those venues that costs more for a single day than most people earn in a year. Finn had insisted on paying for everything, said it was his gift to Jasper. I'd offered to help with the costs. I had some savings from Bernard's life insurance, but Finn had waved me off with that smile he uses when he's being condescending. Without wanting to seem condescending, "Mom, you've done enough already," he'd said. "Let me take care of this." At the time, I thought it was sweet. Looking back now, I see it was the first sign of what was coming, this need to establish that he was the provider now. The important one, the one who mattered. I'd arrived at the venue early, wearing a dress I'd spent weeks selecting. Powder blue with delicate lace sleeves, modest but elegant. Exactly the kind of thing a mother the groom should wear. I'd even gotten my hair done at the salon the day before, my silver curls styled in soft waves that made me feel prettier than I had in years. Cora had helped me with my makeup, her gentle hands applying just enough color to make me look alive without looking garish. "You look beautiful, Mom," she'd said, tears in her eyes. Dad would be so proud. I'd held her hand and thought about Bernard, how he'd loved weddings, how he would have danced with me during the reception, how he would have made terrible jokes that only I found funny. The ceremony was beautiful. Jasper looked so handsome in his tuxedo, and Autumn was radiant in her lace gown. I cried through the vows, the way mothers and grandmothers do at weddings, happy tears that felt like a benediction. After the ceremony, we moved to the reception hall, a massive room with crystal chandeliers and round tables draped in ivory linens. I'd been seated at a table near the back with some of Bernard's distant cousins, people I barely knew, but I didn't mind. I was just happy to be there, to witness this milestone, to see my family thriving. The reception proceeded normally at first. There were toasts. Autumn's father spoke about love and commitment. Her maid of honor told funny stories about their college days. And then it was time for the best man to speak. Jasper had chosen his uncle Wade, my youngest son, for this honor, and Wade gave a sweet, slightly rambling speech about growing up with Jasper and watching him become a man. When Wade finished, the DJ announced that there would be one more toast, a surprise from the father of the groom. My heart swelled. I hadn't known Finn was planning to speak, but I was excited to hear what he'd say about his son. Finn stood up from the head table, microphone in hand, looking confident and polished in his expensive suit. He smiled at the crowd, that charming smile that had always gotten him whatever he wanted, and began to speak. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Jasper and Autumn," he said. "This is a special day, a day about family, about where we come from and where we're going. And I think it's important, on a day like this, to be honest about our family history." Something in his tone made my stomach clench. There was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that didn't match the smile on his face. "My son Jasper is a remarkable young man," Finn continued. "He's educated, successful, about to start a career in corporate law. He's everything a father could hope for, and I'm proud to say that he got here through hard work and determination, not through handouts or charity." The room was quiet now. people sensing that something was off but not quite understanding what. I certainly didn't understand. I was still smiling, still proud, still oblivious to what was coming. Then Finn looked directly at me. Our eyes met across that crowded room, and I saw something in his face that I'd never seen before. Contempt, pure, undiluted contempt, unlike some people in this family, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone. Jasper understands the value of ambition. He wasn't raised by someone who was content to stay small, to live a mediocre life, to accept poverty as a badge of honor. My smile faltered. Poverty, what was he talking about? Jasper wasn't raised in a house where there was never enough money, where his mother had to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, where Christmas meant generic brand toys and homemade clothes that other kids made fun of. The room had gone completely silent now. People were looking between Finn and me, confusion turning to discomfort. Cora stood up from her table, her face pale. Wade was shaking his head, mouthing something I couldn't make out, but Finn kept going, his voice getting louder, more aggressive. My mother, he gestured toward me with the microphone, and 200 pairs of eyes turned to look at me in my powder blue dress. My mother was a waitress, not just any waitress, but the kind who came home smelling like grease and desperation every night. The kind who couldn't afford to send me to college, who couldn't buy me the same clothes and opportunities that my friends had, who made me grow up embarrassed and ashamed. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. My son, my firstborn, my baby boy wasn't saying these things in front of all these people, but he was. He absolutely was. So today, as we celebrate Jasper, Finn continued, I want to thank him for breaking the cycle, for choosing to be more than what he was given, for understanding that sometimes you have to leave behind the people who held you back, even if those people are family, especially if those people are family. He raised his glass. To Jasper and Autumn, may you build a life that's everything your parents couldn't give you. What happened in the moments after that toast destroyed not just me, but our entire family. The reactions from the guests, from my other children, and from Jasper himself would reveal truths I'd spent decades hiding from. But the real devastation was still to come, because what I discovered later about why Finn did this was even more heartbreaking than the humiliation itself. When 200 people stared at me with pity in their eyes, I wanted the floor to swallow me whole. But the nightmare was just beginning. The silence after Finn's toast was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that feels physical, like a weight pressing down on your chest, making it impossible to draw breath. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Around me, Bernard's cousins shifted uncomfortably, not knowing whether to look at me or away from me, whether to offer comfort or pretend they hadn't heard what everyone had just heard. 200 people had just learned that I was poor, that I'd worked as a waitress, that I'd failed to provide for my children in the ways that apparently mattered. 200 people now saw me as a source of shame. Cora was the first to move. My beautiful, fierce daughter stood up from her table with such force that her chair tipped backward, clattering against the floor. What is wrong with you? She shouted at Finn, her voice cracking with emotion. How dare you? How dare you say those things about Mom? She was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks, her hands shaking with rage. Wade was on his feet too, his face flushed red, heading toward the head table where Finn stood with the microphone still in his hand, that infuriating smile still on his face. But it was Jasper's reaction that broke my heart all over again. My grandson, the boy I'd babysat every weekend when he was little, the child I'd rocked to sleep and read stories to and loved with every fiber of my being, just sat there at the head table looking, relieved, not shocked, not angry, relieved, as if a burden had been lifted, as if a truth he'd been afraid to speak had finally been said aloud. His new wife Autumn looked confused and uncomfortable, but Jasper, he was nodding slightly, his hand on his father's arm in what looked like support. I couldn't stay in that room another second. I stood up on shaking legs, my vision blurring with tears, and started walking toward the exit. I didn't run, I was too old and too proud to run, but I moved as quickly as my 72-year-old body would carry me, past tables of guests who whispered behind their hands, past the DJ who had stopped the music, past the elaborate floral arrangements that had cost more than I'd spent on groceries in a month. Behind me, I could hear Cora screaming at Finn, could hear Wade's deep voice saying something I couldn't make out, could hear the general commotion of a celebration turned catastrophe. I made it to the venue's parking lot before I completely broke down. The June sun that had seemed so beautiful earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every wrinkle on my face, every age spot on my hands, every sign that I was old and irrelevant and, according to my own son, a source of shame. I leaned against someone's car I didn't even know whose and sobbed in a way I hadn't sobbed since Bernard's funeral. These weren't pretty tears. These were ugly, gut-wrenching sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside me that I didn't know that depth existed. Cora found me there 10 minutes later. She wrapped her arms around me, and we cried together, mother and daughter, holding each other up in a parking lot while a wedding reception continued inside without us. I'm so sorry, Mom, she kept saying. I'm so sorry. I don't understand. I don't understand how he could do that, but I understood, even in my devastation. I understood perfectly. Finn had always been different from my other children. Even as a little boy, he'd been acutely aware of what we didn't have, of how we compared to other families, of the gap between his aspiration and our reality. I'd met Bernard when I was 19 years old, a girl with dreams of college and a career that evaporated when I got pregnant with Finn. We'd gotten married quickly, the way you did back then, and Bernard had dropped out of technical school to work at a factory so we could support our growing family. He was a good man, a loving husband and father, but we were never going to be rich. When the factory closed down, Bernard found work as a maintenance man, and I started waitressing to supplement his income. We did what we had to do. We survived, but surviving wasn't enough for Finn. Even as a teenager, he'd been embarrassed by our small house, by my waitressing uniforms, by Bernard's calloused hands and worn boots. He'd been accepted to a state university on a partial scholarship, and he'd worked multiple jobs to cover the rest, determined to lift himself out of what he saw as poverty. I'd been proud of his drive, his ambition, his refusal to accept limitations. I hadn't realized that his ambition was built on a foundation of shame about where he came from, shame about who his parents were, shame about me. Wade joined Cora and me in the parking lot, his face still flushed with anger. He's drunk, Wade said, though we all knew that wasn't a sufficient explanation. He's been drinking since before the ceremony. Sloane said he's been stressed about work, about money, about keeping up appearances. Those 3 words explained everything and nothing. Finn had built a life based on appearances: the big house, the luxury cars, the expensive clothes, the important job. And apparently, having a mother who'd been a waitress didn't fit that image. We stood in that parking lot for nearly an hour, the 3 of us trying to make sense of what had happened. Finally, Cora called a rideshare to take me home. She wanted to come with me, but I told her to go back inside, to salvage what she could of Jasper's wedding day. Don't let Finn ruin everything, I said, though of course he already had. Wade walked me to the car, holding my arm like I was fragile, like I might break, and maybe I would have if he'd let go. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. I live in a small 1-bedroom place in a senior living community, nothing fancy but clean and comfortable, with a little balcony where I grow tomatoes in the summer. When Bernard died, Finn had suggested I move into a nursing home, said it would be easier for everyone. I'd refused, determined to maintain my independence for as long as possible. Now I wondered if his suggestion had been less about my welfare and more about his embarrassment at having a mother in such modest circumstances. That night, alone in my apartment, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through old photo albums, pictures of Finn as a baby, chubby-cheeked and smiling. Finn on his first day of school, holding Bernard's hand. Finn at his high school graduation, the first person in either of our families to finish high school. Finn at his wedding to Sloane, looking happy and proud. When had he started being ashamed of me? When had my love stopped being enough? My phone rang constantly that evening. Cora calling to check on me. Wade calling to tell me what had happened after I left. Apparently Finn had tried to continue the reception, as if nothing was wrong. But half the guests had left in disgust, friends from my church calling because word had already spread about what happened. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. I didn't have the energy to rehash my humiliation over and over again. But one call I did answer was from Jasper's new wife, Autumn. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, her young voice uncertain and apologetic. I'm so sorry about what happened. I had no idea Finn was going to say those things. I want you to know that Jasper and I don't feel that way. We love you, but even as she said it, I remembered Jasper's face during that toast, the relief in his eyes, and I knew she was lying. Maybe not intentionally, maybe she even believed what she was saying, but it was still a lie. Jasper had known, maybe not the exact words his father would use, but he'd known something was coming, and he'd been okay with it. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of messages on my phone, but the one that made my blood run cold was from Finn's wife, Sloane. It was a text message, short and devastating. Eleanor, I'm sorry about yesterday. Finn has been struggling with some things. Can we meet for coffee? There's something you need to know about why he did what he did. I stared at that message for a long time, my heart pounding. Part of me didn't want to know. Part of me wanted to just let this wound scab over, to add it to the collection of hurts that life accumulates. But I knew I had to understand. I had to know why my son had chosen a wedding, of all places, to destroy me. What Sloane revealed to me over coffee the next day would shatter everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Finn. The truth about his resentment, about his secrets, and about the real reason for his cruelty would force me to confront painful realities about the cost of motherhood and the price of sacrifice. When my daughter-in-law told me the truth over coffee, I realized that my son's hatred had been building for decades, and I'd been too blind to see it. I met Sloane at a coffee shop downtown, one of those trendy places with exposed brick walls and expensive lattes that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table away from other customers, her perfectly manicured hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking from. Sloane had always been kind to me in that careful, distant way that wealthy people are kind to those they consider beneath them. She was beautiful, blonde, thin, expensively dressed, and she'd always made me feel frumpy and old in comparison. Though she'd never said anything overtly unkind. Eleanor, she said as I approached, standing to give me an awkward half-hug that smelled of designer perfume. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I sat down across from her, my hands shaking slightly as I ordered a regular coffee from the hovering barista. We made small talk for a few minutes. The weather, how beautiful the wedding had been before the toast, how sorry she was about everything, but I could see she was working up to something, gathering courage for whatever she'd asked me here to say. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked directly at me. Finn is broke, she said simply. Just like that, no preamble, no softening the blow. Not just broke, drowning. We're drowning. The business failed 2 years ago. We've been living on credit cards and loans, trying to maintain appearances, trying to keep up the lifestyle while everything falls apart behind the scenes. We're going to lose the house. We're going to lose everything. I sat there stunned, trying to process what she was telling me. Finn was broke. Finn, who'd just paid for an elaborate wedding that must have cost $50,000 or more. Finn, who drove a Mercedes and wore custom suits and belonged to an exclusive country club. I don't understand, I said. The wedding, Jasper's wedding. He paid for all of it. Sloane's laugh was bitter and brittle. He paid for it with money we don't have. Money borrowed from his business partner, who's now suing us. Money from a home equity loan on a house that's already underwater. Money we needed for mortgage payments and credit card minimums. But Finn insisted. He said we had to maintain the image, had to show everyone that we were still successful, still important, still better than. She trailed off, but we both knew how that sentence ended. Better than where he came from. Better than me. The toast, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. He was blaming me for what? For his financial problems, for choices he made as an adult. Sloane shook her head, and I could see tears forming in her carefully made-up eyes. It's worse than that, Eleanor. It's so much worse. Finn has been in therapy for the past 6 months. Court-ordered therapy after he had a breakdown at work and threatened his business partner. And in therapy, he's been processing things, blaming things. He's convinced himself that the reason he's failing now is because of how he grew up, because of the poverty, because of the shame he felt as a child. She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text messages between her and Finn, messages where he ranted about his childhood, about never having enough, about being the poor kid at school, about watching other families take vacations while we could barely afford groceries. Messages where he blamed Bernard and me for not giving him more, for not sacrificing more, for not being more. He's rewritten his entire childhood, Sloane said quietly. In his version of events, you and Bernard were neglectful, almost abusive in your poverty. He's convinced himself that you held him back, that if you just worked harder or been smarter with money, his whole life would have been different. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. We did everything we could, I whispered. Bernard worked himself to exhaustion. I waitressed night shifts so I could be home with the kids during the day. We went without so they could have. We sacrificed everything. Sloane reached across the table and took my hand. I know you did. I've seen the pictures, heard the stories from Cora and Wade. But Finn has twisted it all in his mind. He's made you the villain of his story because accepting responsibility for his own failures is too painful. The barista brought my coffee. And we sat in silence for a moment while I tried to absorb this information. My son, my firstborn, had spent decades nurturing resentment toward me, building a case against my motherhood, rewriting history to justify his own shortcomings. And then he'd chosen his son's wedding, a day that should have been about love and family, to publicly eviscerate me, to announce to everyone that his mother was the source of his problems. The therapist told him to confront his trauma. Sloan continued, to speak his truth about his childhood. But I don't think the therapist meant for him to do it like that, in front of 200 people at a wedding. That was all Finn. He'd been drinking before the ceremony, working up the courage, and then he just exploded. He'd written the toast beforehand. He'd planned it. This wasn't a drunken mistake or an impulsive moment. He meant every word. I thought about Jasper then, about my grandson's relieved face during that toast. And Jasper, I asked, did he know? Sloan nodded slowly. Finn talked to him a few weeks before the wedding, told him about his difficult childhood and how his parents had failed him. I think he was trying to bond with Jasper, trying to explain why we couldn't contribute more financially to his life now that we're broke. Jasper's ambitious like his father. He's already worried about maintaining his standard of living as a young lawyer, and Finn gave him permission to distance himself from the parts of the family that don't fit the image he wants to project, which means me. I said. It wasn't a question. Sloan didn't answer, which was answer enough. My grandson, the baby I'd rocked and loved and celebrated, had been taught by his father to be ashamed of me. The cycle was continuing, this toxic legacy of shame about poverty, about working class roots, about the sacrifices made by people who loved you but couldn't give you everything. We sat in that coffee shop for another hour, Sloan telling me more details about Finn's breakdown, his failing business, his mounting debts, his desperate attempts to maintain an image that was bankrupting them literally and figuratively. She told me that Finn had started gambling, trying to win back what he'd lost, which only made things worse. She told me that their marriage was falling apart, that they barely spoke anymore except to fight about money. And through it all, Finn blamed his childhood, blamed his poverty, blamed me. What should I do? I asked finally, my coffee long cold in front of me. Sloan looked at me with something like pity. I don't know. I'm telling you all this because I thought you deserved to know the truth, to understand that what happened at the wedding wasn't really about you. It's about Finn's inability to accept his own failures. But I don't know how you fix that. I don't know if you can. I left that coffee shop feeling older than my 72 years. My body ached, my heart ached, my soul ached. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to be a good mother, trying to provide for my children despite limited resources, trying to give them love even when I couldn't give them material things. And my eldest son had taken all of that sacrifice, all of that love, and transformed it into a weapon against me. He'd made my poverty something I'd had no control over into a character flaw, a failing, a reason to mock me publicly. I thought about calling him, trying to talk to him, trying to understand his pain even though he'd shown no interest in understanding mine. But I was tired, so tired. At 72 years old, after a lifetime of trying, of fighting, of sacrificing, I was exhausted. And I realized something sitting in my car outside the coffee shop. I couldn't fix Finn. He was a grown man with his own demons, his own failures, his own journey to take. All I could do was decide how I would respond to his cruelty, how I would protect myself, how I would move forward. I thought I'd hit rock bottom after learning the truth about Finn's resentment. But what happened next would test me in ways I never imagined. When Cora discovered something that put my entire family in jeopardy, I had to make an impossible choice: protect my son despite what he'd done to me, or let him face the consequences of his actions alone. 3 weeks after the wedding, I learned that Finn's betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was criminal. And somehow, I was the only one who could save him. Life has a cruel sense of timing. Just when you think you've reached the bottom of your pain, when you think you've suffered all you can suffer, it finds new depths to push you into. 3 weeks after Jasper's wedding, after 3 weeks of sleepless nights and endless replaying of that awful toast in my mind, after 3 weeks of phone calls from concerned friends and awkward encounters at church where people didn't know what to say to me, I received a call from Cora that would change everything again. Mom, we need to talk, she said, her voice tight with stress. Not over the phone. Can I come over? 20 minutes later, my daughter was sitting on my small couch in my small apartment, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. She'd brought Wade with her, and seeing both my younger children looking so serious made my stomach clench with dread. What's wrong? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. How much more wrong could things get? Wade spoke first, his deep voice gentle but firm. Mom, we've been doing some digging into Finn's finances. Not snooping, exactly, but trying to understand how bad things really are, especially after what Sloane told you. And we found something really bad. He pulled out a folder thick with papers, bank statements, invoices, legal documents, and spread them on my coffee table. Finn hasn't just been failing in business. He's been committing fraud. Real fraud. The kind that gets you arrested. I stared at the papers, not understanding what I was looking at. Numbers and transactions and official-looking letterhead swam before my eyes. Cora leaned forward, pointing to specific documents. Finn's been embezzling from his business partner, Mom. He's been creating fake invoices, diverting client payments into personal accounts, forging signatures on loan documents. He's stolen over $300,000 over the past 2 years. His partner found out last week and went to the police. There's going to be an investigation. Finn could go to prison. The word hung in the air like a curse. My son, the baby I'd brought home from the hospital 47 years ago. The toddler who'd clutched my hand on his first day of school. The young man who'd walked across that stage to get his college diploma could go to prison. How do you know this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Wade and Cora exchanged glances. Sloane called Cora, Wade said. She's terrified. She's cooperating with the investigation to get immunity for herself. But Finn is going to be arrested any day now. I should have felt satisfaction. Some part of me should have felt vindicated. Should have thought that this was karma. That Finn was getting what he deserved after publicly humiliating me. But I didn't feel any of that. I felt sick. I felt scared. Because despite everything he'd done, despite the cruelty and the blame and the mockery, he was still my son. I'd carried him in my body for 9 months. I'd fed him and clothed him and loved him for nearly 5 decades. And now he was facing the destruction of his entire life. There's more, Cora said quietly. The prosecutor is looking into everyone in Finn's life, trying to build a case about conspiracy and money laundering. They've already questioned Sloane and Jasper. And Mom, she paused, looking at me with fear in her eyes. They want to question you too. Finn made several large cash deposits into his accounts, and when asked about the source, he told them the money came from you. From your savings. My mouth fell open. What? I never gave Finn any money. I don't have that kind of money to give. Wade nodded grimly. We know. But Finn created a paper trail that suggests you did. He forged bank records showing transfers from your account to his. He's trying to make it look like you were complicit, or at least that the money came from a legitimate family source rather than embezzlement. He's using you as his alibi, Mom. He's throwing you under the bus to save himself. The room spun. This couldn't be real. My son wasn't just ashamed of me, he was framing me for his crimes. He was willing to let his 72-year-old mother take the fall for fraud she didn't commit. Can they prove I didn't give him the money? I asked desperately. Cora shook her head. Your bank records show several large withdrawals over the past 2 years. Cash withdrawals. Finn knew your habits, knew that you sometimes take out cash for groceries and bills. He matched his fake deposits to your real withdrawals, making it look like you gave him that money. I thought back to those withdrawals. A few thousand here and there, taken out for household expenses, for church donations, for birthday gifts for my grandchildren. Normal, ordinary withdrawals that had now been weaponized against me. What do I do? I asked, looking between my 2 younger children. Do I need a lawyer? Am I going to be arrested? Wade leaned forward, his face serious. We've already consulted with a lawyer, Mom, a good one, a criminal defense attorney. He says the case against you is circumstantial, that with your bank records and testimony, he can probably prove you didn't give Finn that money. But there's a problem. He paused, and I could see him struggling with what he had to say next. The problem is that proving your innocence might require you to testify against Finn, to tell the prosecutor that you didn't give him money, which means confirming that he forged documents and lied about the source of his funds. You might have to be the witness that sends your own son to prison. The implications of that statement crashed over me like a wave. I could save myself by destroying Finn, or I could protect Finn and risk my own freedom, my own reputation, my own life. At 72 years old, after a lifetime of sacrifice, I was being asked to sacrifice again either my son or myself. There's one other option, Cora said quietly. Finn's lawyer has reached out to us. If you're willing to testify that you did give Finn the money, that it was legitimate family gifts, it might help his case. It wouldn't get him off completely, but it might reduce his charges, maybe keep him from going to prison. But Mom, her voice broke. If you do that, if you lie for him, you could be charged with obstruction of justice or perjury. You could go to jail. I sat there on my couch, in my small apartment with its second-hand furniture and clearance sale decorations, trying to comprehend the choice I was being asked to make. My son had publicly humiliated me, blamed me for his failures, spent decades resenting me for circumstances beyond my control, and was now trying to frame me for his crimes. And I was being asked to consider sacrificing my freedom to protect him. What kind of mother does that make me if I refuse? What kind of fool does it make me if I agree? I need time, I said finally. I need time to think. Cora hugged me, and I could feel her shaking. Whatever you decide, Wade and I will support you. We love you, Mom, and we're so sorry that Finn has done this to you. After they left, I sat alone in the growing darkness of my apartment, not bothering to turn on lights, just sitting with the weight of impossible choices. I thought about Bernard, about what he would advise me to do. He'd always been the practical one, the one who could see situations clearly without the fog of emotion. I thought about all the times I'd sacrificed for Finn throughout his life. The times I'd worked double shifts so he could have a winter coat that wasn't from the thrift store. The times I'd gone without lunch so he could have seconds at dinner. The times I'd prioritized his needs, his wants, his dreams over my own comfort or security. And after all of that, after a lifetime of putting him first, he'd chosen to mock me publicly and frame me criminally. How much more was I expected to give? How much more could I give? But I also thought about what it would mean to testify against him, to be the instrument of his imprisonment. Could I live with that? Could I look at myself in the mirror knowing I'd sent my own son to jail, even if he deserved it? The maternal instinct that had driven every decision I'd made for 47 years was screaming at me to protect him, to save him, even at the cost of myself. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, was asking a different question. After everything he's done, what do you owe him? After he destroyed you publicly and tried to destroy you legally, what debt remains? The decision I made about whether to protect Finn or protect myself would tear what remained of my family apart. But before I could even make that choice, I received a visitor who would reveal the final, most devastating truth about my son's betrayal and force me to confront the real cost of unconditional love.
When my grandson Jasper appeared at my door with tears in his eyes, I finally understood that some family bonds are worth breaking, and some sacrifices should never be made. I'm 72 years old, and I've learned that life's hardest lessons often come when you're too tired to learn them. 2 days after Cora and Wade told me about Finn's fraud and his attempt to frame me, 2 days of sleepless nights weighing impossible choices, I heard a knock on my apartment door at 7 in the morning. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I was afraid it might be the police, coming to arrest me for crimes I didn't commit. But when I opened the door, I found my grandson Jasper standing there, still in his suit from work, his eyes red and swollen from crying. "Grandma," he said, his voice breaking. "Can I come in?" I let him in, of course, because despite everything, despite the relief on his face during that awful wedding toast, he was still my grandson, still the baby I'd loved and cared for. He sat on my couch and put his face in his hands, and for several minutes, he just cried while I sat beside him, not touching him, but present, waiting for whatever had brought him to my door at dawn. Finally, he looked up at me, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. Genuine remorse. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the wedding, for not defending you, for letting Dad say those things. I'm sorry for being relieved when he said them. I'm sorry for being ashamed of you." The words tumbled out of him like a confession, like a dam breaking. "I've been so messed up, Grandma, so focused on my career and my image and being successful that I let Dad convince me that you were the problem. That being associated with poverty, even poverty from decades ago, would somehow hurt my reputation." He told me then about conversations with his father over the past year. Conversations where Finn had systematically poisoned him against me, against our family history, against the very foundation of where we came from. Finn had told Jasper that the Whitmores were trash, that my waitressing job had been a disgrace, that Bernard had been a failure who'd settled for mediocrity. And Jasper, ambitious and young and hungry for success, had listened. He'd absorbed his father's shame and made it his own. But then the police came to interview me about Dad's fraud. Jasper continued, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "And they told me that Dad was trying to blame you, that he'd forged documents to make it look like you gave him money. And something just broke inside me, Grandma. I realized that the man I'd been listening to, the man I'd been modeling myself after, was willing to send his own mother to jail to save himself. What kind of person does that? What kind of man does that? I didn't have an answer. I'd been asking myself the same question for days. Jasper reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I'm a lawyer now," he said. "Not a criminal lawyer, but I understand the system. And I've been doing research, talking to people, trying to figure out how to help you. Grandma, you can't protect him. You can't lie for him. If you do, you'll be throwing away your freedom, maybe your life, for someone who has shown you nothing but contempt. You don't owe him that. He's my son," I said simply, and those 3 words contained everything, all the complexity, all the pain, all the impossible weight of maternal love. Jasper shook his head. He's a 47-year-old man who made his own choices, who committed crimes, who publicly humiliated you, and is now trying to frame you for his mistakes. At what point does your obligation to him end? At what point are you allowed to choose yourself? Those questions hung in the air of my small apartment, and I thought about all the times throughout my life when I'd been asked to choose between myself and my children. Every time I'd skipped a meal so they could have seconds. Every time I'd worn the same coat for another winter so they could have new clothes. Every time I'd worked an extra shift instead of resting my aching feet and back. Every single one of those choices had felt natural, instinctive, right. But this choice felt different. This wasn't about sacrifice. It was about enabling, about protecting someone from the consequences of their own actions at the expense of my own well-being and freedom. "Your mother told me that Finn has been in therapy," I said to Jasper. "That he's convinced himself that his childhood poverty traumatized him. That my failures as a mother are responsible for his problems now. Do you think that's true? Do you think I failed him?" Jasper looked at me with something like wonder. "Grandma, I've seen the pictures. I've heard the stories from Aunt Cora and Uncle Wade. You worked 3 jobs. You went without so your kids could have. You loved them fiercely and completely. The only failure was that you couldn't make poverty disappear. And that's not a failure, that's just reality. Dad has twisted his childhood into something it wasn't, because accepting responsibility for his own shortcomings is too hard." We talked for 2 more hours, my grandson and I. Really talked in a way we never had before. He told me about the pressure he felt as a young lawyer, the constant comparison to his peers, the fear of not being successful enough, rich enough, important enough. He told me that his father's toast at the wedding had actually damaged Jasper's reputation among his colleagues, that people had been disgusted by Finn's cruelty, that Jasper had been fielding uncomfortable questions and dealing with the fallout, and he told me something that broke my heart. "I don't want to become him, Grandma. I don't want to be a man who values success over decency, who's willing to destroy the people who love him to maintain an image. I want to be better than that." After Jasper left, I sat alone with my thoughts for a long time. I thought about the mother I'd been, the mother I'd tried to be, the mother Finn claimed I'd been. I thought about Bernard, about how he'd loved our children without reservation, without expecting gratitude or recognition. I thought about Cora and Wade, who'd turned out kind and decent despite the same poverty Finn claimed had damaged him. And I thought about what kind of example I'd be setting if I sacrificed my freedom, my integrity, my truth, to protect a son who'd shown me nothing but contempt. The next day, I called the criminal defense attorney Wade had recommended. I told him everything about the wedding toast, about Finn's financial problems, about the forged documents, about the pressure I was under to lie for my son. And then I told him my decision. I would tell the truth. I would testify that I never gave Finn money, that the documents were forged, that I was an innocent 72-year-old woman being used as a scapegoat by her own son. I would not lie. I would not go to jail for his crimes. I would not sacrifice myself one more time for a child who'd made it clear that my sacrifices meant nothing. The attorney was relieved. He told me we had a strong case, that my bank records and testimony would likely be enough to clear me of any suspicion. He also warned me that my testimony would probably help convict Finn, that I would be, in effect, sending my own son to prison. I told him I understood. I told him I'd made my peace with it. I didn't tell him that I cried for 3 hours after hanging up the phone, or that I felt like I was betraying every maternal instinct I'd ever had. Some things you keep to yourself. Finn was arrested 2 weeks later. The news spread through our community like wildfire. Successful businessman arrested for fraud, embezzlement, forgery. Sloan filed for divorce immediately. Finn's business partner held a press conference announcing the charges. And through it all, Finn maintained his innocence, claimed he was being set up, insisted that family members were lying about him. He never once acknowledged his guilt, never once apologized for trying to frame me. The trial took place 6 months later. I testified for the prosecution, sitting in that witness box with my hand on the Bible, telling the truth about the money I'd never given him, the documents I'd never signed, the scheme I'd known nothing about. I didn't look at Finn during my testimony. I couldn't. If I'd looked at him, if I'd seen my baby boy sitting at that defense table, I might have broken. I might have faltered. So I kept my eyes on the prosecutor, on the jury, on anyone except my eldest son. Finn was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted that Finn's attempt to frame his own mother was particularly egregious, that it showed a profound moral bankruptcy that warranted a harsher sentence. I sat in the courtroom and listened to those words, and I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not anything. I was empty, hollowed out by the whole ordeal. Cora and Wade took me out to dinner after the sentencing. We didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate, but we were together, the three of us, survivors of a family tragedy that had been decades in the making. "You did the right thing, Mom," Cora said, holding my hand across the table. "You protected yourself. You told the truth. That's all anyone can ask." But I wasn't sure I believed her. The right thing shouldn't hurt this much. The right thing shouldn't feel like losing a child all over again. I'm 72 years old now, as I finish writing this story. It's been 3 years since Jasper's wedding, since that awful toast, since everything fell apart. Finn is in prison, serving his sentence. I haven't visited him. He hasn't asked me to. Sloan remarried, moved to another state, started a new life far away from the wreckage of the old one. Jasper visits me regularly now. He and Autumn are expecting their first child, and they've asked me to be involved in their baby's life. That grandchild will never know the man his or her grandfather could have been. Only the cautionary tale of what happens when shame and resentment eat away at your soul. People ask me sometimes if I regret my decision. If I wish I'd protected Finn. If I wish I'd sacrificed myself one more time. And I tell them the truth. I regret that I ever had to make that choice. I regret that my son became a man who would put me in that position. I regret the poverty that shaped his shame, the society that taught him to value wealth over character, the pain that twisted him into someone unrecognizable. But I don't regret choosing truth. I don't regret choosing my own survival. Because at 72 years old, after a lifetime of sacrifice, I finally learned that you can't save someone who's drowning if they're determined to pull you under with them. My story doesn't have a happy ending. Real life rarely does. But it has an honest ending, and maybe that's worth something. I'm alone now more than I'd like to be, but I'm free. I'm poor, but I'm not ashamed. I'm old, but I'm still here, still standing, still surviving. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others isn't selfish, it's simply human. Maybe setting boundaries with your children, even adult children who've hurt you, isn't betrayal, it's self-preservation. Maybe love doesn't mean endless sacrifice. Maybe it means knowing when to let go. If you're reading this and you're struggling with similar choices, whether to protect someone you love at the expense of yourself, whether to keep giving to someone who only takes, whether to maintain family ties that strangle rather than support, I want you to know that it's okay to choose yourself. It's okay to say enough. It's okay to let go. You don't stop being a mother, a father, a family member when you set boundaries. You just become a person with limits, with needs, with a right to your own peace and safety. And there's no shame in that. None at all. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story. Thank you for witnessing my pain and my choices. If this story touched you, if it resonated with your own struggles, please share it. Not for views or attention, but because maybe somewhere out there is another parent facing an impossible choice, and maybe knowing they're not alone will give them the strength to choose themselves. May you all have the courage to love wisely, not just deeply. May you all know when to hold on and when to let go, and may you all find peace with the choices you make, even the ones that break your heart.